The important pockets tonight are in Preston Guildhall, the home of one of snooker's most famous events, the United Kingdom Championship.
Steve Davis.
1987 here saw Steve Davis win it for a record 6th time. "12 months ago, Davis was beaten in the final by Stephen Hendry, who's become the game's new and outstanding #1 player. And this weekend, they've come together again, the final of the 1990 Stormfield Championship. 31 frames over 2 days for £110,000. And we'll have the story of day one here in about 50 minutes from now.
And in 20 minutes, man from Auntie Ben Elton has his usual cutting comments about life. First, on BBC One, it's time for the news. It's 10 o'clock.
Iraq has told the United States we will talk about Kuwait. But the message to Baghdad from Washington is there won't be negotiations. Ration coupons in Leningrad as the food shortages grow worse. And the big breakthrough, Britain and France are joined together. Good evening. Iraq has officially accepted the invitation by President Bush to take part in talks to find a way to stop a war in the Gulf. Mr. Bush had said he would send his Secretary of State to Baghdad if Saddam Hussein sent his Foreign Secretary to Washington. But it's far from clear what they will talk about. America's Vice President Dan Quayle said tonight there'd been no change of policy by Washington and it was not a negotiation. But Iraq said it wanted a serious dialogue, and the talks would have to link the question of Palestine with the Gulf.
The crisis here has entered a new, probably decisive phase, though that's not immediately apparent from the well-worn chants of the demonstrators, most of them light-hearted in Baghdad's warm winter sun. Today they were marching to condemn the UN resolution authorizing force, the act which changed the diplomatic equation, allowing Washington to issue its invitation and Iraq to accept it. But the offer from Washington hasn't affected the atmosphere at these highly organized street demonstrations. There's still condemnation of America and promises to fight for their country. But significantly, the organizers canceled a similar march to the US Embassy. And whatever Washington says and the demonstrators do, in Baghdad there's talk of compromise. They don't believe President Bush is offering a meeting simply to drive home his determination to enforce the UN resolutions.
There must be something else, in my opinion.
So what do you think that other thing might be?
Well, I think the Americans try to listen to what we are trying to say.
Do you think the Americans are ready to make a compromise?
Well, I think so.
The cautious official statement accepting the American invitation said Iraq was ready for a serious dialogue, not a superficial meeting which the White House could use to silence its domestic critics. It said the talk should include discussion of Saddam Hussein's August the 12th initiative. Then he linked the Gulf crisis with the settlement of other Middle Eastern issues, particularly the Palestinian problem. That's always been rejected by the Americans. In Iraq today, the dead of the war against Iran were remembered. There's relief here that direct talks, however limited their agenda, are finally to start. Tonight, the US chargé d'affaires left for the Iraqi Foreign Ministry. With so little common ground between the two sides, the going will be difficult. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Baghdad.
And that difficulty was underlined tonight by Dan Quayle, who said the question of Palestine would not be on the agenda of any talks that might take place. But he also said the resolution passed by the United Nations Security Council earlier this week was not an ultimatum to Iraq.
George Bush knew his offer of talks with the Iraqis might be seen as a sign of weakness, the first to flinch as the stakes are raised. And tonight, an Israeli minister compared Secretary of State James Baker's planned visit to Baghdad to Neville Chamberlain's Munich trip. America has always said Iraq must leave Kuwait unconditionally. Israel fears any Gulf compromise would be at its expense. In accepting the idea of talks, Iraq repeated its call for an Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories. The Americans say they won't buy the bargain. Vice President Dan Quayle insisting today there is no linkage and Palestine is not an issue that's on the table.
These are not negotiations. The United Nations resolutions are very clear. We're not over there to reward Saddam Hussein for his aggression.
Kuwait has welcomed the American offer of talks, though the ambassador in London says he's not expecting much from them.
Knowing Saddam Hussein, from our experience, I don't have to be optimistic, but let me hope just that this will happen, and of course this will prevent the war.
The Americans aren't optimistic either. A top White House official declared tonight that Iraq and the US may have an incompatible perspective on the purpose of talks.
The Saudi Arabian commander of the international forces in the Gulf, Lieutenant General Khalid, has given a cautious welcome to President Bush's proposal. But the general, who met British troops today, says the joint forces are still prepared for war.
Watching the shifting political situation while surrounded by the huge Allied military shield, Prince Khalid of Saudi Arabia met British troops today and talked of President Bush's latest move.
That is tackling every corner to solve the problem politically instead of war. And now it's a chance for President Saddam to react. If he doesn't react, then I think we are all ready to do our job.
So onto a Challenger tank with the commander of the 7th Armoured Brigade, for the Prince to get first-hand experience of that job. And whatever the military chatter, it is the public demonstration of cooperation which really matters. The Saudi Joint Force Commander, son of the Defence Minister, nephew of the King, on a live firing exercise with the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards. As 29 tanks pounded the desert targets, the Prince pronounced the exercise excellent and was invited to take aim himself. 4 shots fired. The complex and delicate relationship between Allied forces and host nations strengthened, while political maneuverings continue far from the desert. Kate Adey, BBC News, Saudi Arabia.
A former member of the Ulster Defence Regiment has been shot dead in Northern Ireland. His wife was seriously injured. The couple were attacked at Kilrea in County Londonderry. They'd been visiting a site where they planned to build a bungalow.
The couple were just getting into their car when the shooting took place. Police say a number of gunmen drove up alongside and opened fire at close range. They then drove on a short distance before turning round and coming back to open fire again. This time they rammed a car belonging to an off-duty nurse who'd stopped to give first aid. Noel Agnew lives opposite and heard the gunfire.
I've got my mother who's 84 and a sister who had a stroke. I got them on the floor and went out to find this, though there was literally chaos. Because the getaway car seemed to have hit another car, and there were people running down the road, and by the time they got down there, when I got down, the fellow was obviously dead.
The victim's wife was taken to hospital where she's undergone emergency treatment. Her condition's described as serious, but it appears no one else was hurt. The gunman's car was later found abandoned 2 miles away. Just 2 days ago, police warned of an expected upsurge in terrorist activity in the province. Tonight they're reiterating that people here must be on their guard. Earlier today, traffic was brought to a standstill in many parts of Belfast as police set up extra security checks around the city. They're convinced both Republican and Loyalist paramilitaries intend to intensify their campaigns in the run-up to Christmas.
Food rationing began today for millions more Soviet citizens. In Leningrad, the Soviet Union's second largest city, panic buying was reported as coupons were introduced. Earlier, President Gorbachev had ordered groups of workers to oversee food distribution to try to stop supplies reaching the black market.
This is Moscow's Rishki market, the reputed stronghold of the mafia, where goods long missing from state shops are mysteriously available in the brazen black market trading that Mr. Gorbachev is determined to stop. A visit to a butcher's shop with a concealed camera shows the usual empty display cases, but payment of an appropriate bribe, known here as blat, brings admission to the back room and a cache of meat that the owner offers for sale at inflated prices and no questions asked. Meat that should have gone to consumers in the state stores, but which is now being diverted in massive quantities to illegal private dealers. Illicit trading has caused shortages in 95% of consumer items, with widespread rumours that the racketeers are deliberately destroying food to keep prices high. Even the humanitarian aid from Germany, now bringing joy to children in the state orphanages, is thought to be at risk. Police detachments are following its distribution to prevent ambushes. Mr. Gorbachev's new measures recognising that corruption in the supply network is one of the key causes of the critical food shortages. In Leningrad, where rationing begins today, queues are almost endless, with much speculation that the crisis has been deliberately created by conservative officials opposed to Mr. Gorbachev. Something similar happened before Nikita Khrushchev was ousted 26 years ago. Now there's talk of history repeating itself. Martin Sixsmith, BBC News, Moscow.
A warrant has been issued for the arrest of the former East German leader Erich Honecker on charges of manslaughter. The authorities claim that during his period in office, Mr. Honecker ordered guards to shoot people trying to escape through the Berlin Wall. He was swept from power a year ago in the peaceful revolution, and since April he's been living with his wife in the grounds of a Soviet military hospital near Berlin. The president of Chad, Hissène Habré, has fled from the capital N'Djamena as rebel fighters prepared to take the city. He's now reported to be in Cameroon. President Habré left with his government ministers, their families, and thousands of troops. The French government is preparing to evacuate its nationals from Chad, but it says it will not intervene in the conflict. The Labour Party says the Prime Minister is unable to take a positive lead on European policy because he's afraid of upsetting right-wingers in his party. Mr. Major is spending his first weekend as Prime Minister at his home in Cambridgeshire.
The instruction had gone out to photographers, strictly no questions, as Mr. Major and his family posed outside their home near Huntingdon, which he wishes to use instead of Chequers as a weekend retreat. One of his first decisions as Prime Minister has been to ask for a document to go before Cabinet spelling out the government's position on Europe. Labour says it's just there to paper over the cracks.
Quite extraordinary that a government, which should have been preparing for the next stage forward in Europe, sits down at the drawing board and starts all over again. This is not an attempt to work out a policy. It's an attempt to hold the Conservative Party together. Mr. Major had one of the shortest honeymoons on political record. He's elected on Tuesday. On Friday, his own backbenchers are warning him, "We're watching you like hawks."
Labour's leaders will be busy over the next few days, out making speeches, trying to recover the initiative. Their chosen subject in the first round, poll tax and Europe.
The government is urging people who may have been at risk of catching the AIDS virus to come forward for testing. It's thought that new drugs can delay the onset of the disease. Today is World AIDS Day.
Hundreds gathered in central London to highlight the catastrophe of AIDS. There were calls for further research into the virus and more to be done for AIDS sufferers. Above all, the message was that with no known cure, safe sex and the use of condoms is essential if the spread of AIDS is to be stopped. That message was aimed particularly at women. Latest figures show that AIDS is spreading fastest amongst women and children. Pop stars will underline those trends on special AIDS Day programs later tonight.
From an immune deficiency you see called AIDS.
Scientists have developed drugs to delay the onset of AIDS, encouraging the government to promote greater testing.
It has no symptoms for 10 years, so that it is essential that people come forward and take the necessary preventive steps to stop them passing on this major threat to public health this century.
The World Health Organization estimate 10 million people have HIV. They fear the numbers will rise rapidly if there's not a radical change of thinking.
Now with news of another disappointing performance by England's cricketers and the rest of today's sport, David Davis.
England's cricket manager has condemned the performance of his players as poor and unintelligent following defeat in their first match in the World Series Cup. They lost by 7 runs against New Zealand, who had been considered the weakest team in the tournament. Mickey Stewart ordered an extra practice session after describing the way the side played as totally unacceptable.
Alan Lamb agreed. England simply didn't apply themselves, though they could hardly be blamed for the bizarre non-dismissal of Wright. Atherton's catch was disallowed because a competition rule forbids bouncers above shoulder height, and it was breached, according to the umpire. Hemmings, struggling with a calf injury, then suffered more as Wright moved on from 1 to 67. Later he agreed he'd been lucky to earn the Man of the Match award. 27 from Latham in his first match and 50 from Rutherford took New Zealand on steadily once Wright was out. And when Harris was the last to go, New Zealand had accumulated 199 for 6. There'd been only the occasional moment of concern. David Gower's immediate reply had been to hit a 6, followed 2 balls later by an airborne drive to Crowe. Then Smith, equally dashing, stung Crowe's hands once more. Lamb too hit the ball in the air, crucially wide of the fielders, and England moved to 91 before Watson found a way through. With Lamb out for 49, New Zealand seized the initiative, resisted only by John Morris, back in the side after almost 3 weeks. He made an unbeaten 63. With support, he and England might have made their highly reachable target, but his partners didn't get runs, they got out. The last 6 batsmen made 24 between them. New Zealand took their first victory of the competition by 7 runs. Only Morris could hold his head high. He made his way to a dressing room where the talking was to be blunt. No beach, no golf tomorrow. Instead, a compulsory day in the nets.
Crystal Palace have moved up to 3rd place in the English First Division by beating Coventry at Selhurst Park. Goals from Mark Bright and Andy Gray earned a victory that takes them above Spurs. Kerry Dixon's first league goal since September helped Chelsea beat Tottenham in a game in which Gary Lineker scored for Spurs and missed a penalty. With his colleagues, he also had to get a taxi to the match after the team bus had been towed away. Elsewhere, Niall Quinn scored twice as Manchester City beat Queen's Park Rangers, and Lee Sharp followed his midweek hat-trick for Manchester United with their winner today at Everton. So at the top of the table, Liverpool are still 6 points clear of Arsenal, whom they meet at Highbury tomorrow. Leeds stay 5th, they beat Southampton 2-1. In Scotland, Mo Johnston scored his 14th goal of the season as Rangers beat Hearts. Of the top 5 in the Premier Division, only Dundee United failed to win today. They drew 1-1 at St Mirren. Tennis, the United States have won the Davis Cup by beating Australia in Florida. Their doubles pairing of Rick Leach and Jim Pugh beat Pat Cash and John Fitzgerald in 4 sets to give the Americans an unbeatable 3-0 lead in the final. The top 2 clubs in Rugby League's First Division, Hull and Widnes, met today in the first round of the Regal Trophy, and it was Widnes's former Welsh Rugby Union internationals who proved the difference between the sides.
A magnificent game befitting the league's top 2 sides began with a convincing onslaught from Hull, with Rob Nolan's individual try putting them 10-0 up. But it served only to awaken the Welsh Dragons in the Widnes side. John Devereux had already broken through for his side's opening try when he popped up again to score the second. But better still was to come as Jonathan Davis's mesmerising footwork set him free to link again with Devereux and remind the whole of Welsh Rugby Union of the talent they've lost. 10 minutes into the second half, Widnes seemed to have wrapped it up as O'Fire's stunning pace put them 10 points clear. But back came Hull, working an opening for captain Greg Mackey to set up an exciting finish. Widnes, though, held on to win by 24 points to 16.
For the first time since the Ice Age, 8,000 years ago, Britain is linked to France. Construction workers have drilled through the final wall of rock to join the 2 halves of the Channel Tunnel. They celebrated with champagne, and the tunnel is already in use.
At 11 o'clock this morning, just half a metre of rock separated Britain from continental Europe. It took the drills just a few moments to cut through the final obstacle. Then Philippe Cosette, a miner from Calais, was shaking hands and exchanging flags with Robert Fagg, his opposite number from Dover. The British and French miners went on drilling, creating a full-size passageway between the 2 halves. For the first and only time, the strict ban on alcohol underground was abandoned as the tunnellers toasted their success in champagne. Then the first Britons to walk from England into France arrived to have their passports stamped. Shortly afterwards, the French party pulled into Folkestone. They too had to go through customs and immigration formalities. Also on the train was the newly appointed Transport Secretary, Malcolm Rifkin.
The physical contact that has been achieved between Britain and France today is symptomatic of many changes that we have been experiencing in the last 20 years. It's all happening and it's all continuing to happen in an accelerating pace.
Today, Downing Street called the breakthrough a tribute to private enterprise. But the French want to see more British government support for BR's planned high-speed rail link across Kent to match the one they've already built. Now that the complete tunnel is a reality, Britain's poor rail links will go higher on the European political agenda. But that's for the future. Today has been reserved for celebrating an amazing technical achievement.
Le français, le britannique.
So the continent no longer isolated. Tonight's main news again. Iraq has accepted the offer by President Bush for talks on the Gulf crisis, but it isn't clear exactly what they will talk about. The Americans say it is not a negotiation. The Iraqis say the talks will have to cover the Arab-Israeli conflict. That's it from the newsroom. Good night.
Hello. Now, the air was quite poor in Belfast today, but it will get better as our high sinks down the tube and allows isobars and weather fronts gradually to come southwards across the country over the next few days. Just at the moment, it is rather cloudy. That's no bad thing at this time of year. It does mean that most of us will avoid frost and fog. Just a very few patches of fog overnight, some rain in the far north as well. And just a little bit of frost, most places a couple of degrees above freezing, but just down to zero in a very few places tonight, and very windy indeed in the far north there. Tomorrow, a cloudy day for most of us. Some rain in the north and later the west of Scotland, the rest of us dry, a lot of cloud, some bright spells, mainly in eastern districts, but generally speaking, a grey day. Quite windy again in the north, near gale force in the far north of Scotland, but still very light winds in southern districts, and the temperatures not too bad at all. Indeed, mild in Scotland. You live in this 52 Fahrenheit. In the south, around 7 or 8 Celsius, 45 to 46 degrees Fahrenheit. Most places dry on Monday as well, a little drizzle in places, and most places dry on Tuesday too. Again, rather cloudy. Temperatures about normal for this time of year, but the outlook later on in the week is for colder, windier, and much less settled weather. That's it. Good night.